Somewhere over the English Channel in the winter of 1944, a lone American fighter descended through a gap in the clouds. Below, 9 German aircraft flew in tight formation, unaware of the shadow falling toward them. The Corsair's engine had been throttled back to near silence. Its pilot had painted the aircraft in colors no manual had authorized. The first German pilot to die never saw what killed him. Neither did the second. By the time the formation scattered, 3 aircraft were falling. The question that haunted Allied intelligence for weeks was simple. How does one plane become invisible in an open sky? The winter of 1944 arrived over Western Europe with a particular cruelty. Fog banks rolled across the Channel with the weight of wet wool, settling into valleys and clinging to hedgerows until noon. When the sun did break through, it offered little warmth, only enough light to reveal the gray expanse of a continent at war. Above this landscape, the air war had reached a grinding intensity. American bomber formations crossed into occupied territory daily, their contrails scratching white lines across the stratosphere. Below them, at medium altitudes, fighter escorts wove protective patterns. And lower still, where the clouds broke and reformed, reconnaissance aircraft and fighter bombers hunted for targets of opportunity. The English Channel served as both highway and graveyard. Every crossing carried risk. German fighters operated from bases in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Their radar stations dotted the coastline. Flak batteries protected every bridge, rail, junction, and fuel depot. For American pilots, the mathematics were unforgiving. Every mission subtracted something from the odds of survival. The Marine Corps presence in this theater was unusual. Most Marine aviators fought in the Pacific, where the island-hopping campaign demanded close air support and carrier operations. But a small contingent had been attached to joint operations in Europe, flying missions that ranged from escort duty to ground attack. They brought with them aircraft designed for a different war entirely. The Vought F-4U Corsair had been built for the vast distances of the Pacific. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine generated over 2,000 horsepower, giving it the speed and climb rate needed to intercept Japanese fighters at extreme range. Its inverted gull wings, designed to accommodate a massive propeller while keeping landing gear short enough for carrier decks, gave it an unmistakable silhouette against any sky. In European service, the Corsair was an oddity. Most American fighters over France and Germany were P-47 Thunderbolts or P-51 Mustangs, aircraft that had become synonymous with Allied air superiority. The Corsair's appearance drew curiosity from both friend and foe. German pilots had studied recognition charts filled with American aircraft types, but the bent-wing shape of the Corsair was rare enough to create confusion. This confusion would prove consequential. The pilot who would exploit it had been flying combat missions for nearly 18 months. His name appeared in squadron records and after-action reports, though the details of what followed would remain partially obscured by the fog of operational security and the chaos of a war entering its final decisive year. What is known is this. In the weeks before the mission in question, he had become obsessed with a simple problem. How could a single fighter improve its odds against numerically superior enemies? The standard answer was to avoid such engagements entirely. Fight only with advantage. Never engage alone against a formation. These principles had been drilled into every American pilot since basic training. But war does not always offer ideal conditions. Sometimes circumstances conspired to place one aircraft against many. Engine trouble in a wingman, weather separating a flight, navigation error, the chaos of a dogfight scattering pilots across hundreds of cubic miles of sky. When those moments arrived, doctrine offered little comfort. The pilot began studying something else entirely. He studied how he was seen. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Before the war, he had been a painter, not a professional artist, but a young man who spent weekends with canvas and oils, capturing landscapes near his family's home in rural Pennsylvania. He understood light in ways that most people never considered. The way morning sun transformed a hillside from flat green into a tapestry of shadows and highlights. The way fog diffused edges until objects seemed to merge with their surroundings. The way the eye was drawn to contrast and repelled by uniformity. He enrolled at a small college in 1939, planning to study engineering. The practical choice, his father had called it. Art was fine for weekends, but a man needed a trade. The compromise satisfied no one, but it provided structure during years when the world was beginning to burn. News from Europe arrived in fragments, Poland falling in weeks, France collapsing the following spring, Britain standing alone against nightly bombing raids. The young engineering student followed these events with the same detached fascination most Americans felt. The war was real, but it was far away. An ocean served as both barrier and excuse. Pearl Harbor ended the distance. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in January of 1942, 3 weeks after his 21st birthday. The choice of branch was deliberate. His older brother had served in the Marines during the late 1930s, and family loyalty mattered in ways that transcended logic. Aviation selection came 6 months later, after aptitude tests revealed the spatial reasoning skills that his painting had quietly developed. Flight training consumed the next year. Primary instruction in yellow Stearman biplanes, basic training in heavier aircraft, advanced training in fighters. Each phase eliminated candidates. Washed out for air sickness, washed out for slow reflexes, washed out for inability to handle the psychological pressure of formation flying. The attrition rate approached 50%. He survived each cut with adequate but not exceptional scores. His instructors noted solid stick and rudder skills, good situational awareness, and an unusual tendency to ask questions about aircraft systems that went beyond standard curriculum. He wanted to know not just how to fly, but why aircraft behaved as they did, why certain paint schemes were used, why cockpits were arranged in particular configurations, why some aircraft were easier to spot at distance than others. These questions marked him as either curious or troublesome, depending on who was judging. His first combat assignment came in the Pacific, where the air war above Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands had become a daily contest of attrition. He flew Corsairs against Japanese fighters and bombers, learning the hard lessons that no training could fully prepare a pilot to absorb. He learned that combat happened faster than thought, that decisions made in fractions of seconds determined who lived and who died, that the enemy was not an abstract concept, but young men in other cockpits, equally terrified, equally determined. He learned that survival often depended on factors beyond skill: weather, luck, the random mechanics of where bullets traveled through three-dimensional space. He also learned something that would prove essential later. He learned that he was easier to see than his opponents. The discovery came during a mission over the Slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands that served as a highway for Japanese naval reinforcement. His flight had been vectored toward a reported convoy, only to find empty ocean. On the return, a group of Japanese fighters descended from higher altitude, apparently having spotted the American formation from miles away. The engagement that followed was brief and inconclusive. Both sides traded passes without decisive result. But in the aftermath, during the debrief, one detail nagged at him. The Japanese had seen them first. They had positioned themselves for the bounce with precision that suggested long visual contact. He began wondering why. The American aircraft of 1943 wore paint schemes designed by committees. The reasoning behind these schemes was logical in the sterile environment of procurement offices, but it often failed to account for the actual conditions of aerial combat. Standard Navy and Marine Corps fighters received a two-tone pattern: sea blue on upper surfaces, intended to blend with ocean when viewed from above; lighter blue or gray on lower surfaces, intended to blend with sky when viewed from below. The national insignia, a white star in a blue circle, was applied to wings and fuselage in positions dictated by regulation. This scheme worked well enough for its intended purpose. Ships looking up at defending fighters saw aircraft that merged with the overcast. Submarines scanning the horizon saw shapes that faded into the ocean background. The paint was designed for the horizontal battle, where threats came from the surface. But air combat rarely happened on a single plane. Fighters climbed and dove, they turned and rolled. They presented every possible angle to enemy observers, and at those angles, the contrast between upper and lower surfaces created sharp visual edges that the human eye detected with remarkable efficiency. The pilot began keeping notes. After every mission, he recorded the conditions under which he had spotted enemy aircraft and the conditions under which he had been spotted in return. He noted sun angle, cloud cover, altitude differential, and approach vector. He sketched diagrams of aircraft positions at the moment of first visual contact. Patterns emerged. Aircraft silhouetted against bright sky were visible at extreme range. Aircraft viewed against dark terrain became harder to track. But the most interesting observation involved intermediate conditions. Aircraft flying at the same altitude, against backgrounds of mixed cloud and blue sky, showed wildly varying visibility depending on their paint schemes and their orientation. He realized that the problem was not brightness alone, the problem was contrast. The human eye evolved to detect edges and boundaries. In a natural environment, these edges often indicate threats: a predator emerging from forest, a cliff edge approaching. The visual system is tuned to recognize sudden transitions from one color or brightness to another. Standard aircraft camouflage inadvertently created exactly these transitions. The line between sea blue and sky blue on a Corsair's fuselage formed a distinct boundary that the eye could track even when individual colors blended with background. The white star insignia, essential for identification, served as a high-contrast marker visible for miles. The pilot began to understand that he was not flying an aircraft, he was flying a target. Meanwhile, the air war in the Pacific was shifting. American advances through the Solomon Islands and toward the Philippines had been purchased with blood. Each island taken brought new airfields into American hands and reduced the range advantage that Japanese forces had enjoyed. But the cost in aircraft and pilots remained severe. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese aviators were receiving degraded training. The attrition of experienced pilots meant that replacements arrived at frontline units with fewer flight hours and less combat instruction. This should have provided American advantages, and in many ways it did. But it also meant something else. Less experienced pilots relied more heavily on basic visual acquisition skills. They searched for aircraft by pattern recognition. They looked for the shapes and colors they had been trained to identify. And American aircraft, painted in their distinctive schemes, provided exactly those recognition cues. The pilot began to wonder what would happen if those cues were removed. The idea came to him during a mail call in the spring of 1943. A package from home contained art supplies his mother had gathered at his request: brushes, small tubes of oil paint, and a color-mixing guide he had used during his college years. His tent mates assumed he intended to paint pictures, landscapes, perhaps, or portraits to send home. The assumption was reasonable. Many servicemen filled their idle hours with creative pursuits, but the pilot had something else in mind. He began with small experiments. Cardboard scraps painted in various patterns, held at distance and observed against different backgrounds. He photographed these tests when film was available, comparing results. He consulted engineering manuals on optical perception and human vision that he had requested through the unit's library system. The results confirmed his intuition. Solid colors, even colors that matched backgrounds closely, created distinct shapes that the eye could track. But patterns that broke up the outline of an object, that disrupted the boundary between figure and ground, made that object significantly harder to detect. Nature had understood this principle for millions of years. The stripes of a tiger were not random. They broke the animal's silhouette against the vertical lines of grass and bamboo. The spots of a leopard fragmented its form against the dappled light of a forest floor. The countershading of a fish made it nearly invisible from above and below. Why should aircraft be any different? He brought his findings to his squadron commander in June of 1943. The reception was polite but unenthusiastic. The commander pointed out that aircraft paint schemes were determined by Bureau of Aeronautics specifications. Individual pilots did not have authority to modify their aircraft's appearance. Furthermore, any unauthorized markings could create identification problems. Friendly fire incidents were already too common. Adding non-standard camouflage would only make matters worse. The pilot accepted the rejection without argument, but he did not abandon the idea. Instead, he began working within the constraints he faced. He could not paint his aircraft without authorization, but he could study the problem more rigorously. He could gather data. He could build a case that might eventually convince authority to listen. His transfer to the European theater came in late 1943, part of a small Marine contingent assigned to joint operations with Army Air Forces units. The move disrupted his experiments, but provided new opportunities. European conditions differed markedly from the Pacific. Weather was more variable. Terrain presented different visual backgrounds, and the enemy aircraft he faced had their own camouflage philosophies developed through years of combat over Europe. German fighters wore schemes designed for continental operations, upper surfaces in mottled grays and greens, lower surfaces in lighter gray or pale blue. These patterns had evolved through trial and error, adapted to the forests and farmland of Central Europe. American pilots in Europe reported that German aircraft were often difficult to spot against ground clutter. The mottled patterns broke up aircraft outlines in ways that solid American colors did not achieve. The pilot noted this with interest. His opportunity came in January of 1944, when his squadron was temporarily assigned to a forward airfield in southern England. The base was small, improvised from farmland with minimal administrative oversight. The maintenance crews were overworked, focused on keeping aircraft flying rather than enforcing paint regulations. He approached the crew chief responsible for his Corsair with a proposal. The aircraft had suffered minor damage during a recent mission and required touch-up painting anyway. What if that touch-up included some additional work? Nothing that would permanently alter the aircraft. Nothing that could not be removed if ordered. Just some experimental patterns that might prove useful in combat. The crew chief was skeptical but not opposed. He had flown as a waist gunner on B-17s before a back injury grounded him, and he understood the life-and-death stakes of aerial combat better than most administrators. If the pilot believed this would help him survive, the crew chief was willing to look the other way. The work began the following night. The Corsair sat in a revetment at the edge of the airfield, partially hidden by canvas tarps that the crew chief had arranged to obscure the unauthorized modifications. The pilot worked in the hours after midnight, when activity on the base had dropped to minimum levels and his presence near his own aircraft would draw little attention. The paint had been requisitioned through creative interpretation of supply procedures. Some came from aircraft touch-up stocks. Some came from ground vehicle supplies. Some had been mixed from pigments obtained through barter with British units stationed nearby. The result was a palette of grays, greens, and dark blues that no official specification had ever authorized. The pilot's approach drew on everything he had learned. The basic scheme retained the darker upper surfaces, but now those surfaces were broken by irregular patches of lighter gray and muted green. The transitions between colors were soft, blended rather than sharp, eliminating the hard edges that his experiments had shown were so visible at distance. The undersurfaces received similar treatment. Instead of uniform light gray, they now carried subtle variations in tone that mimicked the way overcast sky actually appeared, with areas of brighter and darker gray that changed with viewing angle. The national insignia presented a particular challenge. It could not be removed without creating serious identification problems, but it could be modified. The pilot reduced the white portions, using off-white paint that lowered contrast while remaining visible for positive identification at close range. The blue circle was extended and blurred at its edges, breaking the perfect geometric shape that the eye tracked so efficiently. Most critically, the pilot addressed the boundaries of the aircraft itself. The Corsair's distinctive gull wing created a recognizable silhouette at almost any angle. To disrupt this, he applied patterns that extended across wing and fuselage in ways that obscured where one surface ended and another began. From certain angles, these patterns made portions of the aircraft seem to disappear entirely, as if the machine were fragmenting against its background. The work took 3 nights to complete. On the morning of the 4th day, the pilot removed the tarps and examined his aircraft in daylight for the first time. The Corsair looked strange, wrong somehow, as if it had been damaged or abandoned. The patterns created an unsettling optical effect, making it difficult to judge the aircraft's exact shape or size. Standing 50 yards away, the pilot found his eyes sliding past the machine, struggling to focus on it clearly. He felt the first real hope he had experienced in months. The first combat test came 4 days later, during a fighter sweep over occupied France. The mission profile called for 4 Corsairs to patrol an area south of Calais, engaging targets of opportunity and providing early warning if German formations were detected approaching the Channel. Weather conditions that morning were typical for January. Broken clouds between 8,000 and 12,000 feet. Haze limiting visibility to perhaps 10 miles at altitude. Occasional gaps in the undercast revealing the gray-brown terrain of winter farmland below. The flight launched at 0830 and crossed the Channel without incident. Over France, the formation spread into a search pattern, each pilot scanning assigned sectors while maintaining visual contact with wingmen. 40 minutes into the patrol, the flight leader called a warning. Aircraft sighted to the southeast, altitude approximately 10,000 feet, bearing 140. Counting 9 bandits, formation appeared to be German fighters, possibly Focke-Wulf 190s. Standard doctrine in this situation was clear. 4 aircraft against 9 was unfavorable odds. The flight should maintain formation, report the contact, and withdraw unless engagement was unavoidable. Seeking combat against a numerically superior enemy, especially when that enemy held position and altitude advantage, violated every principle of fighter tactics. But the flight leader made a different calculation. The German formation appeared to be flying a predictable course, likely transiting between bases rather than actively hunting. If the Americans could achieve surprise, they might be able to inflict damage before the enemy could organize a coherent response. He ordered the flight to climb into the cloud layer above, using the concealment to work around to the southeast, positioning for a diving attack from the sun. What followed demonstrated both the potential and the chaos of aerial combat. The four Corsairs entered the clouds, losing visual contact with the enemy and with each other. Radio discipline prevented constant chatter, so each pilot navigated independently, attempting to reach the assigned rally point where the attack would commence. The pilot with the experimental camouflage emerged from the clouds slightly ahead of schedule and significantly displaced from his intended position. Instead of being above and behind the German formation, he was nearly level with them and off to one side, his nose pointed roughly perpendicular to their course. In that moment, he faced a choice. He could attempt to relocate to the planned attack position, which would take time and might reveal his presence. He could call the flight leader and request instructions, which would break radio silence. Or he could attack now, alone, trusting that his wingmen would join the engagement once firing began. He chose the third option. What happened in the next 90 seconds became the subject of subsequent intelligence analysis and remained partially unclear even to those who participated. The pilot banked his Corsair toward the German formation, maintaining a shallow angle of approach that kept his aircraft silhouetted against the cloud layer behind him rather than against bright sky. His throttle was partially retarded, reducing the noise signature of his approach and minimizing the visual cue of exhaust smoke. The Germans did not react. He closed to effective gun range, less than 300 yards, before the formation showed any sign of awareness. By then, his finger was already on the trigger. The Corsair's 650 caliber machine guns fired in a concentrated burst that raked across the rightmost element of the German formation. The lead aircraft of that element shed pieces and began trailing smoke immediately. The wingman, attempting to evade, broke hard into the American's path and took hits across the engine cowling and cockpit area. By the time the other 7 German aircraft began defensive maneuvers, the pilot was already through the formation and diving for the cloud layer below. The remaining Corsairs arrived seconds later, adding to the confusion. The German formation, already scattered by the first attack, never reformed into a coherent defensive group. Individual dogfights broke out across a cubic mile of sky, the kind of chaotic fur ball that favored whoever could maintain situational awareness longest. The pilot with the experimental camouflage did not re-engage immediately. Instead, he circled below the cloud layer, climbing back toward the combat from an unexpected direction. When he rejoined the battle, he found the surviving German aircraft attempting to disengage, diving toward their home airfield. One straggler, an FW-190 trailing glycol smoke from a damaged cooling system, was limping behind the others at reduced speed. The pilot positioned for a firing solution and closed to less than 200 yards before the German pilot showed any sign of awareness. The burst was brief and accurate. The Focke-Wulf's smoke trail thickened to black, and the aircraft entered a steepening spiral toward the ground. The flight reformed south of the engagement area and returned to England without further contact. Debriefing revealed the full scope of what had occurred. Of 9 German aircraft engaged, 3 had been destroyed with confirmed crashes. 2 additional aircraft showed significant damage and were assessed as probables. American losses were 0, though 1 Corsair returned with bullet holes in the tail section from a brief exchange during the main engagement. Intelligence officers were particularly interested in one detail. Multiple German aircraft had passed within easy visual range of the experimental Corsair without reacting. Photographic evidence from gun cameras showed German pilots looking toward the American aircraft and apparently failing to identify it as a threat. The camouflage had worked. The aftermath of the January engagement generated interest at levels well above the squadron. An intelligence officer from 8th Air Force Headquarters visited the forward base 2 weeks later, accompanied by a civilian specialist in optical engineering who had been working on related camouflage problems. They examined the modified Corsair in detail, photographing it from multiple angles and in various lighting conditions. They interviewed the pilot about his design process and his observations during combat. They collected the gun camera footage and the after-action reports. Their conclusions, submitted in a classified memorandum dated February 1944, acknowledged that the experimental camouflage had demonstrated measurable effectiveness under the specific conditions of the January engagement. However, they also noted significant concerns about replicating the approach at scale. First, the paint patterns had been designed for specific environmental conditions. European winter weather, with its predominant overcast and muted terrain colors, differed substantially from Pacific tropical conditions or the clear skies of high-altitude bomber escort. A camouflage scheme optimized for one environment might prove counterproductive in another. Second, the modified national insignia created genuine identification risks. In the confusion of combat, Allied pilots needed to distinguish friend from foe in fractions of seconds. Any modification that impaired this recognition, even slightly, could result in friendly fire incidents that might exceed the benefits of reduced enemy detection. Third, standardized production and maintenance procedures depended on uniform paint specifications. Implementing individually customized camouflage for thousands of aircraft would require infrastructure changes that were impractical during wartime operations. The memorandum recommended continued study rather than immediate implementation, but the recommendations were not entirely negative. The civilian engineer proposed a series of controlled experiments that would evaluate camouflage principles under standardized conditions. He suggested that certain elements of the pilot's approach, particularly the disruption of aircraft outlines through boundary-breaking patterns, might be incorporated into future specifications without requiring complete scheme redesign. These experiments proceeded through the spring of 1944, though the pilot who had initiated the investigation was not directly involved. His unit rotated to different missions, conducting ground attack operations in support of the Normandy invasion preparations. Meanwhile, the principles he had explored began influencing broader discussions about aircraft visibility. Technical intelligence reports from the Pacific noted that Japanese aircraft were increasingly difficult to distinguish against certain backgrounds, suggesting that enemy camouflage had improved. German night fighters had adopted dark undersurfaces that made them nearly invisible during nocturnal interceptions. The American response evolved accordingly. New paint specifications issued in mid-1944 incorporated lessons learned from field experiments, including subtle gradations in surface colors that reduced contrast under varying lighting conditions. Statistical analysis of these changes proved difficult. Too many variables influenced combat outcomes for any single factor to be isolated. But anecdotal reports from pilots suggested that the newer schemes reduced the range at which American aircraft were first detected by enemy observers. The pilot himself flew 37 additional combat missions before the end of the war in Europe. His personal aircraft retained the experimental camouflage throughout, periodically refreshed by the same sympathetic crew chief who had enabled the original modification. After-action reports from these missions showed outcomes roughly consistent with squadron averages. The pilot was neither conspicuously successful nor notably unlucky compared to his peers. What the reports did not capture was how many engagements he avoided entirely because opposing aircraft failed to detect his approach. Some evidence suggests the number was significant. German prisoner interrogations conducted after the war included occasional references to encounters with American fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere, engaging without warning from unexpected positions. The specific aircraft types mentioned varied, but the descriptions often included confusion about where the threat had originated. The fog of war obscured many such details. Individual combats were rarely documented from both perspectives. The experiences of pilots who did not survive could not be recorded. What remained were fragments pieced together by historians in subsequent decades. The pilot returned to Pennsylvania in September of 1945, one of millions of American servicemen transitioning back to civilian life. He completed his engineering degree on the GI Bill and took a position with an aviation manufacturer, working on systems that had nothing to do with camouflage. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiments. The classified nature of the intelligence reports he had contributed to may have influenced this reticence. Or perhaps, like many veterans, he simply preferred not to revisit a period of his life marked by violence and loss. His personnel records show a conventional post-war career. Marriage in 1948, children in 1950 and 1953, promotions that reflected competence without brilliance, retirement in 1982 from a company that had been absorbed by a larger conglomerate a decade earlier. The Corsair he had modified was scrapped shortly after the war, its experimental paint scheme undocumented except in the classified photographs that remained in government archives. These photographs were eventually declassified in the 1980s, though by then few people remained who understood their significance. The broader legacy of his work proved more substantial than any individual record could capture. The principles he had identified, the disruption of outlines, the softening of color transitions, the importance of viewing angle and background conditions became fundamental to aircraft camouflage design in subsequent decades. Modern stealth technology extends these principles into realms he could not have imagined. Radar-absorbing materials and angular geometry achieve in the electromagnetic spectrum what his paint achieved in the visible spectrum. The goal remains the same: to be present without being perceived, to occupy space while denying observers the information they need to locate and engage. But the most human element of his story transcends technology entirely. He saw a problem that experts had overlooked. He pursued a solution through patient observation and systematic experimentation. He accepted rejection from authority without abandoning his conviction. And he tested his ideas in the most demanding laboratory available, the unforgiving arena of combat, where failure meant death. This pattern appears throughout the history of military innovation. Individuals noticing discrepancies between official doctrine and observed reality, unauthorized experiments conducted in defiance of bureaucratic caution, small modifications that propagate through organizations as their effectiveness becomes undeniable. The specific contribution of one Marine pilot, with an artist's understanding of light and shadow, cannot be measured with precision. The war produced millions of such stories, individual insights that accumulated into collective progress through mechanisms too complex for any single narrative to contain. What can be said is simpler and perhaps more important. In a sky filled with machines designed to kill, one man asked a question that others had not thought to ask. Why am I so easy to see? The answer he found saved lives, possibly including his own. The method he used, curiosity disciplined by evidence and tested by courage, offers a model that extends far beyond any single war or any single technology. He died in 1994, remembered by family and former colleagues as a quiet man who painted landscapes in his retirement. The paintings were unremarkable, competent renderings of Pennsylvania countryside that decorated the walls of relatives' homes. No museum collected them, no critic praised them. But those who looked closely at the work noticed something unusual. The paintings contained areas where objects seemed to disappear into their backgrounds, edges that the eye could not quite track, forms that emerged only after sustained attention. The artist had never stopped seeing the world as a problem of visibility and concealment, light and shadow, presence and absence. In the end, that is what survival requires: the ability to perceive what others miss, the wisdom to act on that perception despite doubt, and the humility to recognize that every solution creates new problems, every answer invites new questions, every moment of clarity dissolves into the next fog of uncertainty. He saw what others did not see, and for a few decisive seconds over occupied France, what others could not see was him.